Welcome to the Low Carb Athlete Podcast, where we focus on discussing topics to help you burn fat, optimize health, and improve performance in life and sports. Transform the whole you from the inside out with the holistic method. Let's dive in. Here's your host, Debbie Potts.
Hey guys, it's Debbie, and have you used a CGM before? CGM is continuous glucose monitor, and there's different options out there. Ideally, you can get it from your doctor, but they seem to just want to wait until you're type 2 diabetic and not be preventative. I would like us to take ownership of our health and make choices now to prevent having high, low glucose readings and optimize your health from the inside out by testing and not guessing. And that includes a CGM that goes on for 14 days, and you can order one via NutriSense. And a CGM is giving you glucose updates with a small device in the back of your arm 24/7. Totally easy. I actually did a video on my YouTube channel, Low Carb Athlete, how to apply this CGM. First time, kind of scared, but it doesn't hurt. But it gives you real-time glucose readings. Glucose response to meals. You'll learn about what foods are reactive to you, and that could be a healthy food that you think is great, but it could raise your glucose. Simple things as stevia, for me, raise my glucose. Chewing gum, raise my glucose. Stress, when I'm driving a car and there's traffic, raises my glucose. Every stress response is a glucose response. So learn how to manage your stress. Learn how to pick right foods for you, unless you can, do other lab testing and figure out Vibrant Wellness food zoomers, but it's kind of expensive for people. So if you can wear a CGM, it's a great way to learn about stress, food, exercise, stacking movement with your nutrition. Figure out how to balance your blood sugar. So we want to learn more about how to exercise and eat or not eat. And morning cortisol, does it raise your glucose? If there's hidden stressors at nighttime, does your glucose go up higher while you're sleeping? So it gives us lots of clues that we can put in our investigation when we are working on your personalized fueling, training, and performance program to improve fat loss, performance, and longevity. So head to NutriSense website, nutrisense.io, how it works. You can learn more about your habits, your routines, your relationship to food, a little bit more. Great app to use, and it can sync on to different programs. So you can put it all together. So if you want to get started with your journey in NutriSense, I suggest this to all my clients. Use at least 30 days. So you can do a 30-day, 90-day, different programs, but you can pick which one you want. You get the sensor in the mail, put it on, lasts for 14 days, sync it to the app, and get your readings on there. And then if you're doing my VIP coaching program, I'm working with you to correlate this data together. So begin your health optimization journey with NutriSense, and you can save on your order with our code, as usual, Low Carb Athlete. So no carbs is not our goal, it's carb timing, and using NutriSense, you can help figure out your nutrient-dense whole food plan and when to adjust your macros based on your exercise intensity, duration, based on your life stressors, and learn more. So it's nice to have this data. So test and not guess with NutriSense. Let me know how you like it. Hey guys, it's Debbie, and I'm back after taking July and August of summer 2023 off to focus on doing some continuing education as I finish my Pinoy Metabolic Expert training, as I purchased the Pinoy Metabolic Testing Kit in this past spring so I could offer it in North San Diego and take it anywhere I travel as Kona, Hawaii this December. And then I just am finishing up Dr. Stacy Sims' Menopause 2.0 program. And next I need to start the Wild Health Certification Coaching course. And then I'm going to finish my Endure IQ 2 program so I can join them as an Endure IQ coach. So it's a one thing after another in my world, and trying to focus on following my purpose, my passion, and my mission to help other endurance athletes train, fuel, and perform their best, especially as we are aging and we are getting to the second half of our life. My goal this season is to teach you how to improve the second half of your life so you are thriving and not struggling, and hopefully not using the excuse, oh, I'm getting older, I can't do that. So I'm going to work on sharing different rabbit holes that I've been going into to figure out, all right, how should we fuel? How should we train to perform our best in everyday life, as well as training for our future self? So endurance training is not ideal for our health and longevity. Better to do less is more type of training, minimal effective dose. So we'll go into that, as well as nutrient timing and men versus women and more. But today I bring you Zach Bitter. If you don't know who Zach Bitter is, let me share with some information on Zach. His website is zachbitter.com. And we just recorded a podcast together, and hopefully we will do more as we both focus on coaching the endurance athletes and helping provide free information on our podcast. His obviously is more the ultra endurance athlete. So if you don't know his resume, Zach has broken multiple world and American records throughout his career and helps hundreds of other athletes reach their own personal goals. He helps beginner to advanced runners, regardless of their starting point and style. And he is obviously a good role model because I looked up his bio on Wikipedia. You can find Zach on Wikipedia. His Wikipedia bio says he is an American ultramarathon runner. He holds world records for the 100-miler run and the 12-hour run. I think that's one on the treadmill. I just think is insane. One's on a track. He has claimed both records with his performance during the 6 days in the Dome event in Milwaukee, and that was August 24th, 2019. His 100-mile time of 11 hours and 19 minutes and 13 seconds beat Oleg Katritanova in 2000, who had the records from 2002, but Zach beat his record by almost 11 minutes and was 20 more minutes faster than his own American mark of 11:40:55. After claiming the 100-mile record, Zach Bitter continued running for another 40 minutes and upped his own 12-hour distance world record to 104.8 miles, with an improvement of more than 3 miles over his previous mark. His 12-hour record was beaten by Lithuanian Alek Sorkin in January 2022. And Zach is a low-carb athlete and has been involved with the low-carb, carnivore, keto world over the years and has been in different studies. And I know he works with EndureIQ, or not EndureIQ, S Fuels, and has great information on his own podcast. So you can check out Zach Bitter. He's got references in his Wikipedia. American Zach Bitter crushes 100-mile world record with a 6:48-mile pace. That was in Runner's World, and he's been article American Zach Bitter crushed 100-mile record by running 363 times around a track. That was in the Washington Post in 2019. Zach Bitter runs a 100-mile world record in 11 hours and 19 minutes. That's in Sports Illustrated. Pretty freaking amazing. So definitely interesting to listen to Zach, and his wife Nicole is ultra runner as well. So check out Zach's information. His podcast is great. His HPO Human Performance podcast, HPO podcast, his coaching page, and his information is always sharing is really great. So love to work with Zach Morris. We had a great conversation. So let's bring on our shared podcast going through common questions that we both have from endurance athletes of all different distances, men and women.
Debbie, thanks for joining me for a conversation today.
Yeah, Zach, I'm so excited because I listen to your show all the time, and as a fellow endurance athlete, but more of a ex-triathlete, Ironman athlete, I think there's so many big topics we can collaborate on diving into that I hear you talking about, and I'm talking about my show, and then learning more about the female athlete versus you're a male athlete.
No doubt.
How we can go through all this.
Yeah, I think this will be a fun one. We probably get some similar questions, and then there's always that added piece to the puzzle, like you just mentioned, where if I had to guess, I would imagine that a lot of people who reach out to you maybe skews a little more female than male. Maybe I'm wrong about that. For me, I know it's definitely skewed more male than female. So when I do get females coming in asking questions around like what I'm doing nutritionally, there is that added component that I'm like, well, I have less data that I've collected on this. We can look at the research as best we can and try to determine something from there. But I think it is also fun to have that perspective of someone like yourself who's been doing this for a while. How long have you been more or less playing around with low carb?
Since 2005.
Oh, wow. Okay. So, yeah.
Just as long as you probably, I started doing Ironmans in 2001. And then I started getting into metabolic efficiency testing, treadmill testing and resting testing through New Leaf back then. And then Bob Seebehor, I did a USA Triathlon clinic with in 2008, 9, I guess 8. And then I started putting it together because I had always had these questions as an Ironman athlete and do marathons and 50K trail runs that, all right, how am I supposed to fuel? I'm supposed to burn this fat that's on my body. I'm not losing any weight and I'm trying to do what they tell me to do, having 300 calories an hour on a bike and an Ironman, but I'm throwing up the whole time. So something's not working. So I got into it back then, trying to get answers.
Yeah. Yeah. Triathlon is an interesting, I think Tour de France is kind of similar where it seems like those two sports, they get maybe a little more curious a little sooner. And then running, I think, is maybe the endurance sport where they're just a little, I don't want to say stubborn, but it can be that way where it's like, all right, this is the way it's been. This is the way it has to be. And we're going to stick with this until it slapped us in the face.
Yeah. Until you're broken.
So it is kind of funny to see the variances in those communities in terms of like what willingness they're willing to do to kind of deviate from the norm or the position at the moment and experiment a little bit. And I always find that like an interesting piece to the puzzle is looking at endurance sports, both through the lens of, well, first of all, what are we talking about when we're talking about endurance? Because like, as you just sort of suggested, like pretty wide range of things, especially when you get into ultra marathons where someone will kind of loosely mention endurance and how you should fuel for it. And my mind immediately goes to, well, what are we talking about? Are we talking about the 5K at an Olympic level? Or are we talking about someone trying to finish their 100-mile and manage their rest of their life too? It's like there's so many moving parts and so many different intensities and target intensities within that sport itself. It almost becomes we got to get in some nuance at least before we even begin this conversation.
Yeah, I think what I keep focusing on my show with my clients is how to fuel, train, and perform your best as an aging athlete. As now I'm other side, turned 50. Now I'm 51. And I feel that there's so much we need to look at too as we age, because I'm focused now as I'm on the other side that I need to be more concerned about my future self. So doing the fueling and training and performance plans that work for me to be the best version of myself when I'm 80, 90 years old, as I watch my dad pass away last summer. And then my mom's, 82 and all of her friends. And you just watch people age going, okay, am I doing all the things I should be doing right now to be living my best life, living longer, healthier and happier and thriving instead of struggling every day? So that's kind of my mindset changes a little bit as a competitive endurance athlete to, all right, let's do that, but also look at what am I doing to improve my future self?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting point, and maybe a topic that we could have included, or I guess it maybe fits in with one of them to some degree, is like, you'd have a great perspective on this in the sense that what have you done differently now that maybe you would have done or what are you doing now that you would have done differently back in like, say, 2005 when your younger self was first getting into this? Like, did you see any like kind of shifts over that you thought would be necessary, regardless of whether you were focusing purely on performance or just longevity and things like health and longevity?
Yeah, I think, well, learning more now about long distance stuff. I'm listening to Dr. Stacy Sims. I just am finishing her Menopause 2.0 program, and it's really interesting research on the female athlete as we age and have our hormones change, and how we need to not do what we always talk about, zone 2 and training zone 2, and then doing appropriate HIIT training. But just the changes to do in my training program now for my clients is how we train now to improve our aging is going to be a little different than just what we used to do is ton of, well, zone 2 maffetone, we used to call it. Now it's zone 2. So
Yeah, it used to be
that always makes me laugh
every once in a while.
I know, right? Because I've been metabolic testing, and I worked with Mark Allen starting back in 2001, a maffetone, and now it's suddenly zone 2. I know Peter Attia and Huberman have made that a thing now, but I think it's building that endurance up. And the younger self, yes, I did all the right things when I was doing Ironmans, and I did well. Skip out my personal story was adrenal fatigue in 2013 and not being able to train. So I'm helping people train appropriately. So you're not doing what we'll talk about is the fasted exercise. I was probably doing too low calorie, too strict keto, too much fasted exercise on top of a crazy lifestyle and running my own fitness studio and teaching classes and just being busy all the time and stressed out. And so I haven't been able to race personally since my health issues almost, it's been 10 years now. So I've been really digging into why did that happen to me, not other people. And that's kind of what we're talking about now is, are you doing too much fasted exercise? Are you doing too low or zero carb that your performance is suffering? And are you doing too much training and not enough recovering? And so answer your question before is how I would train now. Future self is depends what age you are. Are you, at my point in life where my hormones are all really low and I need to change how I train and adapt to that and make up for that loss of hormones by doing more short intensity interval training and doing less chronic long distance cardio and focus on more heavy lifting and some plyometrics in there. And so I can not do as much endurance training as I age. And so I think it's important to look at what is your goal? Are you trying to work on performance right now? Are you looking at fat loss? Are you looking at longevity? Because it might be slightly different for that individual depending where they are in their life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that transitions us right into that first topic that we wanted to talk about, which is just fasted and fed exercise. Because I do think this is a really interesting one. And I've been fairly skeptical about intermittent fasting when it comes certainly to performance pretty early on. And I think some of that is maybe just my own bias because I've always been a pretty high I should say this, when I got into kind of the more paying attention to the different variances of nutrition, I was full blown high volume training by then. So my calorie needs for the day were to the point where if I were to intermittent fast, it meant jamming quite a bit of calories into a pretty tight window. And that just didn't seem comfortable either. So I got to the point where if I was just going to intuitively intermittent fast, it was a scenario where at the end of the day, I was like, all right, now I'm just like mainlining nut butter with olive oil added to it to get caught up to the to the energy requirement for the day to make the training plan sustainable. And it just seemed like, well, maybe I could just phase this out. If there's nothing uniquely beneficial for me at the performance side to the intermittent fasting stuff, like why am I doing it? And so I kind of maybe was a little bit overly skeptical, or I guess maybe the way to look at it is I was looking at through my lens a little more specifically than say like the full scope of things. And now I look at it as it's probably good to know the downsides of intermittent fasting that are potentially going to be there regardless of me training for performance or someone who's like, I'm doing some endurance stuff, I'm training for a race, but my primary goal is weight loss. And I look at it there as a situation where intermittent fasting is a control that you can put in place that will likely minimize your intake to some degree just intuitively. So if you're going to do nothing else other than close your eating window down, more likely than not, you're probably going to eat less than when you were just kind of eating like freely. So if the person has body fat that they need or want to lose, and their focus is at least partly that arena, that is one lever that can be pulled there. I think it gets interesting when you start looking at things like what else are you doing alongside that? So like if I'm working with a client, they say, hey, I find that intermittent fasting works really well with me. I work within like say a 16-8 window or 8-16, where you have 8 hours a day that you're eating, 16 you're not. My first thought is, okay, let's make sure you're getting enough protein. And let's make sure that you're getting some resistance training in there. And if possible, let's spread out that protein at the beginning, middle, and end of that 8 hours as best as possible. So we're minimizing to the best we can some of the potential lean mass loss that a lot of the intermittent fasting research suggests will happen at a maybe a little bit higher rate than you would if you were just calorie restricting with a more spaced out approach, or doing a calorie restriction approach where you did like refeeds and not just having a chronic calorie deficit. And I think once they kind of understand just like where the pros and cons are there, they start to recognize like, okay, is this something where intermittent fasting is just, for me at the personal level, something that I prefer to do and helps me. And if I don't do that, I end up falling off of my target. Then let's just be as good as we can within that feeding window to make sure we're not losing lean mass and performances, and also taking a hit as best we can, versus someone who says, oh, I just thought intermittent fasting was the only way to do this, but I'm really open to others. And then we find out like we could do it a different way that works just as easy for them. They just weren't exposed to it yet. So for me, a lot of this is always just kind of like, let's see where their knowledge base is. And then if there's some expansion that would be useful, let's expand it so they're working with all the tools. And then from there, figuring out which tools are going to be most valuable for them at the personal level versus what we maybe see at the individual level.
Yeah, I think it, especially with your audience, is doing the ultra endurance. So you're teaching people to be fat adapted. You're burning fat as your main fuel tank. Carbs are your backup fuel tank when you're sprinting and at race pace. So do we need to eat to kick into fat burning? And I think that got to be the question is why are you fasting? I don't like eating a meal, especially if you're going to go work out at 5:30 in the morning, 6 a.m. I don't want to eat something, but when did fasting, I think 5 years ago, 10 years, well, we got into intermittent fasting, got to be a book, Jason Fung, all these different people getting these books out. And then Dr. Mindy Pelz, and everyone's talking about fasting, and Ben Azadi and all these people in the keto low carb space. And I think a lot of our athletes, is why I wanted to bring this up, are going, okay, I'm going to try that too. But they're talking fasting for healing your body for people that have metabolic issues. It's going to our other question on their list is being 0 carb to no carb, 50 grams or under carbs. Is this all appropriate for the endurance athlete? So when we go into the fasting part, is more, why are you doing the fasting? Is it to help you burn more fat? Is it to help cell autophagy and healing and repairing your body? So it's, I think, looking at why, but I think we got all caught up as athletes into, okay, I'm going to do 16-8. And I did this too. I was super strict. Even if I was working out in the evening, I can't eat after 4 o'clock, but I just lifted weights, but I'm going to bed at 8 o'clock and I'm going to work out first thing in the morning. Well, then are we becoming the LEA, low energy availability? I'm not eating enough to be peak performance the next day. And I think we get so type A driven, strict, that we think, okay, more is better. I'm going to do these 16-hour fasts, and then I'm going to start doing some 22, 24 OMAD fasts. And then I'm supposed to be, this great fat burning athlete. I'm doing all this endurance work. Well, I don't need to eat anything. So I think it gets kind of this downhill spiral for a lot of athletes. And then my female athletes I've been researching is like, okay, should we maybe add in a little something in my coffee before that workout? What is okay? And be aware of your body, how you feel, and experiment that N=1 fueling strategy. Okay, my workout was actually better. Yes, I can go and not eat anything, but did my workout suck? Mm-hmm. Or did I feel amazing and I felt great? So it is so individual, but I think it's what I've learned, and I found this book that I had in my bedside table I was going over, is this is all this fasting information I wrote in last 3 years of everyone's fasting information. And for athletes, it came back to that 12 to 15 hours is 12 hours should be normal dinner to breakfast, breaking your fast in the morning. And then when should you add in some calories before workout, even if it's adding a little butter and cream into my coffee, that it's okay. But the last thing I'll say, I think we get so strict that I'm like, oh, I got to follow these rules and not listen to my own body, what it's asking for that I could use to benefit my performance, because I need to stick with this fasting window, and I only can have water, I only can have black coffee, and I can't break that, even if my workout sucks.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting point, because I was thinking about this just from my own practice standpoint. And the thing I always come back to is like, I don't know why. I mean, I understand why, but I would never want to necessarily say like, all right, intermittent fasting is what I do day in and day out, 365 days a year, 24/7, because my days look so much different from one another. And then what I do the day before may impact whether that's a good idea or not. So like, for example, the other day, I took a rest day where I didn't do any workouts really, and ate in a pretty large calorie surplus. And then that next morning I woke up and I wasn't hungry at all. And I went out for my run and just had a really great workout, didn't eat until after that run for the first time that day. And that was totally fine, because my body was probably thinking, yeah, there was a lot of energy on board. Liver and glycogen were probably fine. I'm going to get through any single training session without too many issues. Now, had that been a different scenario where I had done a fairly big caloric expenditure the day prior and maybe missed my energy intake by a little bit, and then I rolled into that workout the next morning in a state where my body was like looking for some calories, then I would have eaten something then. So those would have been two examples of where potentially an intermittent fast or a longer window without eating in one scenario would have been totally fine from the grand scheme of things from energy balance. Like over the course of those 2-3 days, I was hitting all the stuff I needed to hit, but maybe it was just positioned a little differently from one to the next. And I think people sometimes think of it as like an absolute versus a tool that can be used when it can. And again, I think when you look at it as a tool, then it gives you kind of the freedom to be a little more flexible. So then like, you know, when I have an easy recovery day and I'm not having a very big metabolic demand for that day, I don't feel like I'm eating way less than I normally would, because I can just kind of eat freely, have a calorie surplus. And then when I kind of get back to those bigger metabolically demanding days, afford myself a little bit of flexibility that I don't feel like I got to be eating all the time either. So
yeah. Well, exactly. Your point is you're saying it's going to be individualized and look at your weekly schedule. And I like to look at client schedule Sunday. Let's look at what your life looks like, what your workout schedule looks like, and when is it appropriate to do a little bit longer fast, and then teach people how to be intuitive that, oh, I'm actually feeling hungry, knowing what that feels like to know if it's hunger or if it's psychological, and that maybe I should have something. And that could just be a tablespoon of butter in your coffee, or having something at night, bone broth or something that's easy to digest that won't mess up my sleep. But it is giving yourself permission to listen to your body, and then use fasting as a tool when it's appropriate on your active recovery days, rest week. And then for women, I'm looking at their menstrual cycle, timing it with their cycle too, where that fits in. So it's kind of fun. You can map it all out for females premenopausal, but I think it is fasted exercise is good when it's lower heart rate. So that zone 1, zone 2. And then there's things in men versus women. Women might do better activating their fat burning system if they have a little bit of calories in there. So I've been experimenting and not being so dogmatic, so strict, like, oh yeah, this is how it is. But that's women versus men whole thing, that men can do it fasted exercise better. Women might need a little bit of something, if it's some aminos and creatine, and having something as cream in your coffee and not be, I think it's just experimenting.
Yeah, for sure. And I think like you added an extra point there where I find that once you sort of, if you do just like a reasonable job of kind of like assessing what you're doing throughout the day from an intake and an exercise standpoint, eventually you get to a point where you can sort of predict like, oh, a day like today, I'm probably not going to require a whole lot of fuel before my training session in the morning, or a day like a different day altogether. You kind of know, like, probably go to bed at night. It's like, yeah, I'm going to probably wake up and it's going to be in my best interest to get some food in before I head out this. So I stay on top of things, and the training at the end of the week is high quality.
Yeah.
With women, I think there's probably one more step there where it's like you also are considering, well, what part of the month is it, and how is whether I do that or the other thing going to impact that? With the topic of fasting in general, is there a protocol that you find based on your conversations with Stacy Sims about just like when you're at this part, you should probably just not consider intermittent fasting a good choice, or during this part, this may actually be beneficial for you, that varies with that sort of a setup?
Well, I've talked to Dr. Mindy Pelz, who's all about fasting for women of the fasting cycle. Stacy Sims, I haven't interviewed because she's not all about low carb or eating high fat diet and protein. She's all about, but she doesn't talk about fats, I realize, which build your hormones. But fasting should be normal is what I've heard Stacy say. 12 hours isn't really fasting. That should just be, you stop eating, and that should be normal. Doing the longer fast, she says in her books and the menopause program I just finished, that it's not beneficial because we have more prone to, this is stressful and it's added stress to your body. You might improve performance by having a little bit of calories. It doesn't have to be a lot. Then there's Dr. Mindy Pelz, who maps out the cycle for women, and you don't want to do fasting. And then the Endure IQ program, I think did you do their coaching program? The Endure IQ has a women athlete part that you only should do fasted exercise the middle of your cycle. It's not the whole time. So I think you can really map out what Dr. Dan Plu's program teaches us in their courses. And then Mindy Pelz is talking for the metabolically unhealthy person, not the athlete. So I'm trying to take all this data and all this research and go, okay, well, what about for the aging athlete and the aging female athlete that does endurance work? What's appropriate? So it'd be not fasting your late luteal phase, like day 20 on, not fasting around ovulation, but like before, after, and then matching that to your recovery days, and then still getting your protein. Cause that's the whole thing, going back to the fasting in general, that I've changed my mindset that if I'm doing OMAD, and I used to do that and work out like all day and be moving around, that I wasn't getting enough calories in. But then I focus on what Dr. Gabrielle Lyon talks about, and all of our carnivore friends is saying, oh, you need the ideal grams of protein in an ideal body weight. So if your goal weight is 130 pounds is your ideal weight, you want 130 grams of protein a day, and then getting that almost equal in fat for some people. So how are you supposed to do that in one meal? You can't. So then that's why I started paying attention to, am I hitting those protein goals as the aging female athletes more important to me? Because I'm trying to build muscle and get leaner and stronger and faster as I age, not do the stereotypical aging gain fat. And so you can't really do all this prolonged, 8 hours. It's really hard to fit if you're doing 16-8 to get your protein goals, as you said, too. Because that's a goal, I think, is for athletes. We need that protein.
Yeah. And the protein conversation, I always find interesting because when I'm talking with someone like Dr. Gabriel Lyon or one of my coaching clients who's interested in like, how should I be going around this? Our first step is just what you said. Let's target what would be kind of the top end of what you would likely need to be optimal, which is that gram per pound of body weight. And then like, if you do fall a little short, you're probably going to be fine, since that's kind of the high end of what we would expect you to require, especially if there's some strength resistance work included in the program. And then from there, it's like, how can we optimize a little bit further? And there's like another, what would be a relatively small step on top of hitting that gram total. And that is spreading it out a little bit more than what you would likely see in like an OMAD type style of eating, where now if you have, say, like that protein total that you're taking in for the day spread out between, say, 3 or 4 sessions or servings during the day with about a 3 to 4 hour block in between, it can be like protein muscle synthesis is going to be a little more elevated throughout the day with that sort of a structure versus having it all at once.
Yeah.
And then I think the big piece to that puzzle though too is just the resistance training piece to the puzzle, where it seems like you can make a few more mistakes around protein if you have resistance training in the program. And that alone is going to send signals to your body to kind of preserve or build lean mass versus have it kind of go to the wayside in a calorie deficit or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it gets why we are coaches. It gets so individualized in how to work it out for a client that here's your training schedule. Here are your goals. Here are your struggles in your area of opportunities. What is the best fueling and training program for you in this period of your life right now, this quarter, or, look at your training schedule and races that they're doing. Mm-hmm. So it has to change. But that kind of brings us to our next question, is what I hear all the time and listen to. Everyone seems to be more strict carnivore and that I don't need any carbs. So what's your take on, I know Dan Plews is talking about this on your podcast you did with them earlier this year, about all carbs, are they evil? Mm-hmm. And being strict 0 carb carnivores, keto carnivores, when is it okay to add in strategic carbs in and around a workout if you're trying to improve performance? Because so many people out there that are not in the endurance space, and all my carnivore friends is just at conferences with them, they're like, you don't need any carbs. It's not essential. So you can, make glycogen from fat and protein, gluconeogenesis, and make that. But if you are in a good training workout that you're trying to hit certain times, depending on the time of day you're working out, what you ate beforehand, when it might be beneficial, and in a race situation that you are wanting to go a little faster, you're training above your fat burning ranges that we identify in a test ideally. But when is it appropriate to have some strategic carbohydrates, as we talked to Leighton Phillips of S Fuels and you talked to Dan Plews and DryQ? So what are your thoughts you're doing ultra endurance, mm-hmm. where you at? Basis Sean Baker background too.
Yeah. Well, and I find that was always the interesting thing with Sean, is like Sean and I are on opposite ends of the spectrum from a target in terms of fitness. And we would jokingly say, like, Sean's literally twice as big as me, and he is literally twice as big as me. And his events and his sports are very high intensity. I think the conversation around things like gluconeogenesis or carbohydrate need versus optimization, the details are so important here. So I think someone like Sean, he's doing such explosive type sessions that the amount of volume he's going to do on a day-to-day basis is going to be quite low compared to someone like myself. So his workouts in and of themselves are going to be more glycolytic, but they're going to be a lower amount of total energy burning during any training session that he would do versus what I would do, even with his 2x mass. So he's in a situation where I think, like, just by getting what would be probably above and beyond the requirement for protein, he's going to get a lot more demand-driven gluconeogenesis and likely satisfy the needs for his next session from one day to the next, versus someone who's doing like what I'm doing, where I might go out for a 90-minute session in the morning and have some threshold work in there, where even when my fat oxidation rates are at their highest, I'm going to be tapping into some liver muscle glycogen during a session like that. And then I may be going to the gym for some strength work and an easy run later that day, where I've got a 5 to 6 hour window that I need to kind of make sure my body's back ready to go again, versus, a 45-minute session, 24 hours plus from now. So I think that's where it gets a little more like where the conversation goes from need to optimum. It's like, could I follow a 0 carb carnivore diet strictly and go about my endurance training program? Yeah, I could, but I would definitely struggle to meet the performance metrics that I'm currently hitting. I would see a regression. And I think most people would, minus the group of people who potentially clear up some other issue or issues that are powerful enough that they eclipse the performance dip they're going to get from essentially eliminating an entire tool from their toolbox, which would be the carbohydrate tool. So the way I like to describe this is, if we just look at carbs, fats, and proteins, and we look at them as fuel sources, because if we're going to look at gluconeogenesis, we're including protein as a fuel source then as well, even though I see that as a pretty bad fuel source for reasons I'll explain. But we have carbohydrates, which require fewer steps for our body to take, break down, and use. And then we have fats, which are an energy source, a great energy source, but they're going to take more steps for your body actually to break it down and utilize it as a fuel source. So you want to be mindful of the intensity and the frequency of that intensity when you're deciding on whether fats or carbohydrates are going to be a tool that should be used. And then you have protein, which is primarily going to be for recovery, but like you said, in excess. And for someone like Sean, some of that's going to get broken down, converted, and used in stored glycogen through gluconeogenesis. So that one's going to take even more steps, though. And the body has to work hard to break down protein. When you just look at simply the amount of energy it requires your body to break down carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, we're looking at a pretty similar amount of just like a few percentage points of that food from carbs and fats to be broken down and used. So your body can pretty efficiently use that as a fuel source versus protein. Sometimes we're getting ranges up into the 20% where you're eating protein and it's going to require about 20% of that protein number, calorie, or energy intake for your body to actually break that down and use it for what it is. Because of it, it's just more difficult. So when people say to me like, oh yeah, why don't you rely on gluconeogenesis during one of your races? I'm like, why would I want to have it? Why would I want to make that many steps occur? And then like, for what reason should I believe that it would be even remotely quick enough?
Yeah. Fast enough fuel.
Yeah. Because you know, I'm talking about like, if you look at my best 100-mile performance, that's 9 miles per hour. I would have been burning somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 to 90% fat, 10 to 20% carbohydrate. If I were to say, try to keep on top of that 10 to 20% glycogen burning side of that equation with something like gluconeogenesis, it just isn't going to happen in that 12-hour time frame. So the devil's in the details, as they say. I think you have to be very mindful of your lifestyle. And to kind of go back to what I was saying before, like I have a couple of coaching clients who follow what I would consider a relatively strict carnivore diet. And it's because they have other issues. It's because like they had some sort of digestive issue where when they start introducing any meaningful amount of plant matter into their diet, they have all sorts of problems flare up. And whether they can correct that or not, I mean, that's somewhat of a personal, like, I don't want to say problem, but like a personal thing that they're going to have to try to solve versus trying carnivore, getting success from that, and then just never exploring what they could potentially bring back. Like, I mean, I had one client who was in a pretty rough shape, and he found he was following a keto or Paleolithic, or what was it called? The carnivore Paleolithic way of eating, or ketogenic Paleolithic, which is essentially just a carnivore diet, a little more structure and strict versus like what you maybe see on the interwebs with carnivore, which I think is, I don't even think they agree as to what a carnivore diet is half the time. So, but he was like night and day different because he had such terrible digestive issues. And he even had a fecal transplant, I believe, and was like, didn't get relief from that. So it's like, it wasn't like he wasn't attempting to try alternatives. So for someone like that, I think it's like, yeah, if you are just going to have all sorts of digestive issues left and right, and a carnivore diet is the thing you found to relieve that, you probably will see a performance boost from that sort of a lifestyle versus, say, someone like myself, where if I do a 0-carb carnivore diet, I'm going to see a performance dip. And then when I add some carbohydrate back, I'm going to see that performance normalize. For me, I'm not getting the negative repercussions that person's having by reintroducing the carbohydrate. So at that point, I'm thinking to myself, that's a tool I want to keep in the toolbox versus one I want to necessarily eliminate. So that's generally how I look at it. I try to think of all these things as tools, and then it just becomes like, what is the right fuel that you're going to need to use at the right time in your workout, your training, to kind of maximize that. So low intensity stuff, you know, I'm going to be using more fat-based products, leaning into those a little bit more. I'm going to be using, like, if I want to add a fat-based product to that training session, if it's longer and I'm worried about, kind of like we were talking before, inheriting too big of a calorie deficit, I might use a product like S Fuels Train, which is going to keep the carbohydrates out of it, but give me an energy source along with it, versus say I do a threshold session, a short interval session, or I'm doing a long run and preparing for my race day fueling. Then I might use something like an S Fuels Race Plus, where I'm going to get in some carbohydrates. That is going to be something that I'll want to use on race day, or that will maybe be useful for the glycolytic activity that I'll be having during some of those higher intensity, shorter interval type training sessions.
Yeah, there's a lot. The Race Plus, do you do that in a training workout that's intervals that have you tried it without fuel and with fuel to see if it makes a difference in your performance when you're doing a more of a anaerobic zone 4 or 5 workout?
Yeah. So the way I look at it is I don't, it's not clear to me that like if I wake up in the morning and I'm not hungry and I have, say, like a 75 to 90-minute training session that includes short intervals, that I would need to fuel that workout in order to maximize it. There could be some, it's probably worth trying for someone because there is going to be potentially a scenario where, let's say you get to that last interval and just ingesting that carbohydrate may lower the perceived effort. So if you are noticing your intervals are properly formulated, but you're struggling to get the quality at the end, to maybe explore that option. For me personally, I don't typically see that. So it's more of a question for me as to what's next. So like, let's say it's a scenario where I'm doing that interval session and I got some strength work later that day. And the way I have my foods planned out for that day, I'm just not going to be having a lot of carbohydrate in them. I'm going to probably take in some Race Plus during that session, just so I do have some of that carbohydrate taken care of for that later day training session, versus a day where it's like, I'm just going to go do this workout. Maybe it's a hotter day and I just don't want to introduce a lot of calories during it because it's just one more component to worry about when you're training in the heat. And I know like after that particular workout, I'm going to be able to replace enough of the carbohydrate that I hit during that workout to be ready for that next session. And that's in that particular training session, I wouldn't necessarily feel like I needed to fuel it. Where I typically get a little more firm about like, okay, this training session is just do the fueling strategy, is when I get to the end of a training plan and I'm building out my long run specific to race day, because I'm just using that as a dress rehearsal to make sure I'm doing everything right, from pacing, gear check, fueling strategy for race day, and just checking off, making sure everything is working the way I want it to, so I don't have any surprises on race day.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. I did learn that years ago. I did coaching with Ben Greenfield for Ben, and we learned from Ben's research, some of his seminars is done is when to add in carbs would be when you are doing another workout within 8 hours, and then evening meal adds your carbs, if more like the sweet potatoes, safe starches kind of thing in the evening meal if you're going to do a hard workout the next morning. But yeah, it's timing it, because I always experiment that. I was a triathlete, even though I'm not racing, I still train. Example, yesterday, a bike, and then I ran half hours, some intervals in both. And then I did a swim workout at noon. That I'm always like, yeah, I don't really need to eat. I'm not hungry, but if I want to improve that performance, I don't feel lethargic swimming, that you have to kind of experiment and go back to what your goal is and the timing of that carb, if it's necessary.
That's
that they're not all evil.
Right. That's actually an interesting, maybe kind of side topic that fits probably within one of the categories. When you're working with athletes that are following a little bit of a lower carb diet, is there a trend that you notice where that tends to be better than others for just the timing of the carbohydrate they are eating? Because there's like, this topic gets kind of black and white a lot of times, where you get into this like back and forth of no carb or all carb. So then it's just kind of the answer is clear. You either don't eat them or you eat all of them. But then there's like, I think the majority of low carbers, at least in the endurance world, who aren't strict ketogenic. They're just low carb, or their fat macro is their largest macro. So they do have some carbohydrates to play around with. Do you see any like kind of clear leader in the clubhouse, so to speak, in terms of when they typically would like to have those?
I think it's, if you are doing a harder workout, is experimenting for that client. But for myself, it's been trying to hit post workout, eat in something protein, fat, and it's hard because I keep hearing Stacy Sims speak, and then other people carnivore that like they're so opposite. So I think that's where you have to go, okay, let me try this. So right now, my phase I'm in right now is working on adding some fat and then eat some because I'm never really hungry. So that's a hard thing when you're, more fat adapted, you're not hungry. And adding, say when I eat this morning, I had 2 hard-boiled eggs with salts on them, and I had piece of cheese. And then if I'm swimming later, what I've been experimenting with, maybe I'll have an hour before swimming a half a bar, S Fuels bar, I like, that has some carbs in it, but I have to time it because when I'm swimming, I can't eat beforehand or else I'm regurgitating what I'm eating. So even if I run, I can't really eat before I work out. So especially swimming, I had too much bacon the other day, and my swim workout was kind of like, oh, this doesn't feel good. So I think it's timing, no matter what you eat, that you have proper time to digest it. But then if you need quick and easy carbs, if you didn't eat enough, I've been trying S Fuels or Laird's superfood bar has 10 grams if it's plant-based. It doesn't have dairy in it, but it has some mushroom adaptogens in it. So I've been trying that, like half of it, and see how that feels. But it is, I think we go back to being that strict, type A driven, follow the rules, but not listen to your own body. That instead of being intuitive, we listen to like, oh, I shouldn't eat anything. I don't want to break my fast. I'm going to go work out. I'll burn more fat if I don't eat. But then your workout is a struggle. So it is, again, try it, see if you feel better, but not being afraid, because we hear all these people, oh, no, carbs are all evil. Don't eat anything. You don't need it. Just have a piece of meat and some butter on it. But if I'm doing a swim session at Masters, that's going to be more anaerobic. Yesterday I was struggling. So it's like, well, maybe I need to give myself permission to have a little bit of something, but not crappy foods. We're not saying have a donut, have a bagel, have some, processed foods, but it's okay to have maybe, I don't know. I go to a bar when it's quick and easy, but evening meal, like sweet potatoes or something. I have eliminated a lot of the vegetables, going back to the carnivore people and plant toxins, and all of that part of it is healing your gut and digestive issues with, the carnivore cure type of information Judy Cho is shown in her recent summit. But yeah, I think everyone's so different. It's hard to say. It depends is the answer. But to answer your question is having a little bit of carbs before your anaerobic workout, see if that helps your performance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think like one thing to touch on with that too is I find it interesting with like the plant toxin conversation, because this seems to me to be a lot of times like a threshold issue that maybe ranges a fair bit from one person to the next. And it's just an interesting one, because I find online a lot of the topic is just around kind of like carbohydrate, where it's like an all or nothing conversation of I need to either never touch a plant again because they're literally out there to kill me, versus like I just maybe need to be careful about blending 2 pounds of spinach into a smoothie. It's like there's some middle ground there that I find that I think most people probably would discover as pretty like benign in terms of what the problems it would cause, and potentially very helpful in other areas. So a lot of times I find like the application of a strict carnivore diet to be the most fruitful, in the sense that it's, as far as I can tell, one of the more like clean slate elimination diets you can find out there. So if you are someone who's struggling with digestion, and you say do like a 30-day
reset,
reset, and then take that clean slate as an opportunity to reintroduce some of the foods one at a time, you can get a pretty clear look at which ones are going to be maybe a little more problematic for you versus the other. And I find more often than not, when someone does that, they discover that they don't need to be strict, but they do just maybe need to be mindful about certain groups of foods, or they need to be mindful about the quantity of which they have, or maybe it's just like when they have it too. Like maybe they discover, I can have a cup of steamed broccoli for dinner at night. I just maybe don't want to have it for lunch, or, certain things like that I think kind of open up a few options for them if they're willing to explore it, and kind of ultimately get to that point where they found kind of like an individual path that's going to work for them long term.
Yeah, well, I do more health coaching now. I became a nutritional therapy practitioner over the years, and an FDN practitioner, so I can order functional lab testing and then more investigate what's going on with someone with their external and internal stressors. So that's what I do more so than writing people's schedule. So I'm getting the athletes that are struggling, getting results by doing all the so-called right things, but they can't figure out why their performance is a struggle, or they're not able to lose weight, or work on why they're not recovering. But it is a carnivore. It's a strict food elimination diet, because if you end up removing all those plant toxins, it's just heal and then reintroduce those foods. But it's going back to that 4-day rotation diet, or, a hormetic stress is having a plant just as a workout that's anaerobic, or, a sauna or cold therapy is just another type of stressor, but you just do it once in a while. But if you did that every day, that becomes a chronic stressor. So we could look at it from that lens that, okay, it is a toxin, but what if I just have it once a week, once I've helped heal and seal my gut with proper elimination diet and protocol to heal? and repair the gut issues. But because it's always why is that not working? Why don't you do well with that vegetable? What else is going on that's causing those symptoms? And look at the whole picture and put the missing pieces of the puzzle together. So that's why I think carnivore works for a lot of people, because it's looking at, okay, you've got something broken and it's causing this metabolic chaos. But anyways, I wanted to go into the question kind of with this topic is on our list is you and Dan Plews were talking about this recently, nutritional ketosis for athletes, because we get this all the time. Stephanie and I have this keto endurance Facebook group page that she started years ago, and everyone's always, I don't want to get out of nutritional ketosis on a bike ride or my run. I want to test if I'm still in ketosis. And I'm always like, isn't your goal for performance to burn fat for endurance athletes and being able to use carbs if I'm racing or sprinting at the finish line, finishing with some intervals? But do we need to be in nutritional ketosis all the time is the big question.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And I suspect there's maybe like some range targets that are going to differ from a lifestyle variance, just based on what I've seen. But ultimately, I don't know that that's even important, because it's not clear to me that like some millimole of blood ketones is going to accurately suggest whether you're fat adapted or not. And it sort of becomes this question of like, first of all, what is fat adaptation? And I think it's less of a target and more of a spectrum of how fat adapted do you need to be based on your goals and your lifestyle. So like, yeah, if you're going to go and run 24 hours and take in 0 carbohydrates, you probably need to be quite fat adapted to be able to make that a comfortable experience. But if you're going to do a 24-hour race and not go on a 0 carb diet, the question really is, how much can you expect to be able to take in to defend liver and muscle glycogen during that race? And from there, how fat adapted do you need knowing you can actually use that tool? So what I like to share with people sometimes is like, I've had my fat oxidation tests done in a lab along with blood ketone monitoring. And I've had situations where it's like, I test like relatively low level of ketones, like 0.4 to 0.7 millimoles. And then I get on that metabolic cart and I'm above 1.5 grams per minute from a peak fat oxidation rate. And it's not clear to me that it would be any benefit for me to improve my fat oxidation rates beyond that, because the small amount of fueling I'm going to need to do to defend that in like, say, or an ultra marathon, like I described before, is going to be low enough where I'm not too worried about having a digestive issue personally. But if that was somebody else and we found out, it turns out on race day, their fueling capacity is half of what I can do, they may need to be a little more fat adapted, assuming they're targeting the same intensity. And that's where I think it gets really a little more interesting, is when you look at these things as like, where do I need to be versus where is this peak spot of like, I'm as fat adapted as I can possibly get. Cause there's trade-offs with that. Like as you upregulate your fat oxidation rates, that's likely going to come at the expense of, to some degree, your carbohydrate utilization. So somebody who is like, let's say really, really high, like up into maybe the 2 grams per, they're two grams of fat per minute in their fat oxidation rates. They may not have if you gave someone like that like an oral glucose test, they would probably take a nap immediately after. So then I'm just always curious about like how much of a trade-off are you looking to get in order to have those like off the chart millimoles, and what does that even mean from a performance standpoint? I understand it if it's a therapeutic thing where it's like, okay, this person has epileptic seizures and therefore needs to be in a type or a type 1 diabetic who's using a like a ketogenic diet to manage stuff like that. Then I think, there's a whole nother conversation to be had there. But from a performance standpoint, like, I mean, I've tested blood ketones over the course of training plans where like, there's days where I'm doing like a pretty big, or there's weeks where I'm doing a pretty big variety of different training, and my carbohydrates are kind of reflecting what we described in the past, where I'm targeting them around some of those higher intensity, moderate intensity stuff. And, there are days where I'm testing blood ketones, I'm 2 millimoles. There's days I'm 0.5, and there's no clear indication to me whether I'm performing better or worse due to that. So ultimately, like, getting a fat oxidation test is probably going to give you some real direct details as to where you're at and maybe where you'd want to make some changes. And maybe highlight for somebody like why they maybe don't need to necessarily chase a specific ketone number.
Yeah. No, I agree. It's that chasing the ketones, I think, and forgetting the main purpose as an athlete is to be more metabolically efficient at burning fat at higher rates. So your higher heart rate. So doing the metabolic testing, as I bought Pinoy metabolic testing kit this spring and trying to launch this in North San Diego for athletes to figure out, okay, what are those numbers for you? So, when you test, are you looking at, we use in Pinoy 5 zones, and your zone 2 that we always talk about for endurance training would be your bottom of zone 2 is your max fat burn. And then your top of zone 2 would be your metabolic crossover point where your carb usage goes up and the fat goes down. So is that what you test, your peak fat burning heart rate and where you're burning the most fat, oxidizing the most fat, and then where your threshold crossover point is?
Yeah. Like when the tests that I've done that I really like are ones that they would essentially pin where your aerobic threshold is, your lactate threshold is, and your VO2 max, and then they pair that with your ratios of fats to carbohydrates at those intensities, because that's information that I think you can use. So when I'm planning out like my race day fueling, I'm basing it on that. So it's like if I eat this way, and like my example before, I'm at 1.56 grams per minute at my peak fat oxidation rate. That's an interesting data point for me. But what's even more interesting to me for the race itself is what intensity am I planning on racing, and where does it fall on that spectrum from rest up to VO2 max or beyond? Mm-hmm. And where I'm going to be on that spectrum I'm interested there as to like, what is that kind of carbohydrate to fat oxidation range for me there, because that's going to be more of a clear individual indication as to what I need to target on race day from a fueling standpoint versus just kind of throwing caution to the wind, so to speak, and targeting this like range of carbohydrate intake that's recommended, or that, or pushing the upper limits. Because I think the really funny thing about race fueling to me is like, when I got in, I started doing low carb in 2011. So I'm coming up on like 12 years. So I'm not quite as seasoned as you, Debbie, but I've been doing it. You're not as old as I am. Yeah. It was like at that point, people were, they were pushing the limits of what we knew for race day fueling, but not, from what I could tell, beyond what we've seen in the research of like, you kind of have that situation where a lot of these sports products are formulated to be a 2-to-1 ratio of like maltodextrin to fructose, because that like the clearance for maltodextrin is going to be like 60 grams, fructose is closer to 30 grams. So if you really want to start to really stress your digestion and try to get as much in as you can, that 90-gram number became kind of popular for a while. And now we're seeing people push well past that and try that. And I see that as like sort of like the opposite end of what like I'm doing, where it's like keep some carbohydrates around, but kind of personalize it based on what your fat oxidation rates are showing versus chasing some random number. And it's like, that's equally unstudied as far as I can tell at this point. So it's interesting to see the dialogue around it and like what's working for people or not working for people.
Well, I think that's why it's great to do metabolic efficiency tests if you can, if you're really, wanting to do well in your races and figure out how a more of a specific personalized program when you're training. And then on race days, then you can kind of have, obviously it's guessing a little bit because it's not exact conditions on a treadmill in a lab compared to outside on the trails, but just figure out kind of ballpark figure where you should start at. And then it, of course, correct as needed. But I think a lot of people are just guessing. And we always say, test and not guess where you are. And you don't know what you don't know. So if you're just kind of thinking, because I think a lot of people train in that black hole training, we say the gray zone, that they're not in that fat burning heart rate range and they're doing too much kind of slightly more anaerobic and they're not creating that bigger base. And then when they're doing interval training, and Daniel Crumback and I are actually podcasting Monday, he did our metabolic expert certification course they did for Pinoy, but doing zone 5 or zone 4, if you're doing 1, minutes to 3-minute sprints in zone 4, or zone 5 would be example 10 to 30 second sprints, but you have to come all the way down to zone 1, stay there certain time until you go back up to say zone 5, and you're actually in zone 5 for 30 seconds. Most people don't do their interval training right. So I think testing and figuring out what those numbers are for you. And also we can identify how you're training now, where your limiters are, or I like to say areas of opportunity. So you can figure out a more personalized program. Here's where you want to be, and here's how we can get you there based on these clues we just collected doing testing, and figure out a plan based on that, looking at the whole picture.
Do you do any like alternative like field testing with your clients if they are just not able or willing to go in and get like some of that data that's out there in terms of like a metabolic cart to test to whether they're like, because I mean, the question is like, if I'm like, when I talk about fat adapted enough, the next question is always, well, what is that? And how do I know?
Yeah.
And obviously like getting on a metabolic cart can be make that a little clearer picture as to whether you want to get more fat adapted or not based on your own needs. But if that's not available, how do we kind of get close enough in the field to at least get a starting point to work from is sometimes the question I'll get. Do you have anything that you like to do with your clients to kind of see like, oh, this person's fat oxidation is probably fine. We don't really need to necessarily pull the lever much harder, versus this person's weakness is their body's ability to use fat at, even lower intensities. Therefore, we should start pulling some levers to improve their fat oxidation rates.
So I'll sound really old, but this is where I go back to Phil Maffetone because he's taught me all this. And then Sally Edwards back in, this is really a long time ago, 1995, when I first started learning from her heart zone training. And we would do a heart rate test. So you just go, okay, 110. How do you feel? RPE scale 1 to 10, 120, 130, and do it that way was a test we used to do on a bike. You can do treadmill. So a perceived exertion and kind of guesstimate where that, green zone, comfortable talk test, old school way. Mm-hmm. And then Maffetone always taught us, and I was on Mark Allen elite triathlon team for a long time. And we did Maffetone method, which is now called max aerobic function heart rate, is 180 minus your age, plus or minus 5. If you've been sick or in shape, you do a little calculation, you look at Maffetone method and that, or I guess the math method, and figure out the numbers there. And when I used to do new leaf testing, 2005 until Lifetime Fitness bought the company and took the equipment away in 2012 I used to always compare the test that I was doing on the VO2 max test with the Maffetone formula. And a lot of times it was right where their max fat burning was their MAF number. So if you can't get a real test, you can do the 180 minus your age, which is, walking for some people. So they don't want to do that. But say if, you're 50 years old, you do 180 minus 50. We want to stay at, say, 130 for majority of your training. And then you can do a monthly test to see if you're improving or not. So ideally, like the old story would be Mark Allen would get, so much faster. So every month you do that test, you're 8-minute mile to 7:30 pace to 7-minute at that same heart rate. So you get faster. And then when you don't get improve anymore, then you add in the speed work. Mm-hmm. So that's how we used to train back in the day before testing.
Yeah. It's interesting because I enjoy targeting things in a similar way where I don't necessarily focus on it as maximum aerobic function. I just say it's aerobic threshold is what I'm looking at here, because it's like that crossover point. Yeah, same thing basically. And I'll call that like a base run. And once my base run sort of plateaus for a while and it's not really an option to add more volume, then I'm dropping in some speed work to kind of pull that up. And then I'm just in a weird sport where base or aerobic threshold tends to be race intensity when you start doing 100 miles.
100 miles.
Yeah. So then I'll usually go back to it after some speed work development and really focus on race specific stuff. But I find it interesting. I think the approach is sound. Do you struggle with clients sometimes in terms of having that age adjusted rate be accurate? I think there are people out there who they actually do just need to accept the fact they're gonna have to go kind of painfully slow for a while and let that sink in. But I do have clients who also we sort of stress test it a little bit, and they're just maybe like not quite accurate with that age adjustment, and then we can afford to let them get a little more liberal with their heart rate on those kind of up to aerobic threshold type runs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just have a client who just did my Pinoy metabolic test on her, and she was, before I had the equipment to test her, we were looking, her heart rate was always like 160s all the time and 150s, and she's in her late 50s. And it was interesting to test her that her max fat burning ranges were up up to 160. So she's just ran higher. So I think some people run higher. I remember when I used to test years ago, I had someone that was like 120 heart rate was where they got anaerobic, and they were super fast. So it just depends, I guess, genetics more so, and just where they are. So you kind of can guess, but then, yeah, everyone's unique, individual. And then I look at what medications they're on and what their stressors are, because there's so many things that will increase your heart rate, and look at your resting heart rate and heart rate variability metrics and track that kind of data.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if it's just like something unique to the individuals who will come to me, or if it's more on average, but I'll always get a few that are like that, where they'll have been doing a maximum aerobic function style of training, and they're just really frustrated. It's like, this feels so easy. I'm walking. And I'm like, well, let's stress test this a little bit. Go out and dial up that pace that you've been targeting, that you're saying is really easy, and then just gradually increase it, and just gauge whether you'd be able to carry a conversation.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe, I was just going to say, talk the whole time.
Or nasal breathe. Like if you get to a point where like you're breathing in your nose and out your mouth, and you're going 10, 15 beats faster than that heart rate, we can be pretty safe in assuming that like you have a little more cushion. And yeah, sometimes you get those people where their aerobic threshold is just a little bit of higher heart rate, and they tend to be the ones who I think struggle the most with being really strict with heart rate adjusted age type metrics.
Well, that's where I think it's great to run by yourself, and then when you have friends to run with, because I find that when you're running with people, everyone maybe unknowingly push the pace a little bit, be competitive, that you're kind of more anaerobic the entire time. But if you're running with running partners, maybe they're a little bit slower than you, maybe they're a good partner, so you can slow down and be able to talk the whole time. So if you could just chit chat the whole time on the run, you're not, huffing and puffing, that you can have a comfortable conversation. That's probably a good estimate where a good training pace would be. But
yeah,
it's funny.
I've had a couple clients where I've done this for, where it's like they're going to do like a check-in call or a consultation, and this is the specific topics. Like, let's do your call on your next run.
That's a smart idea. Everyone wears those ear pods now when they run, listen to something. Why don't they just listen? Are they talking? You listen to them.
Just ask some questions. As soon as they're not getting through a sentence, then it's like, okay, slow down.
What's your heart rate? Yeah. What's your heart rate? What's your pace? Put that on your notes. So fun. But I know we're out of time, but anything else? I think we got all of our stuff on the list. Testing your max fat oxidation rate, carnivore, females versus males. We talked a little bit about. I'll just finish with that because I've been just watching a video. I'm doing that course with Stacey Sims, but just women, if they're struggling with the long endurance stuff, it's so fascinating to me to dive into this research for females, like before, after menopause, which is funny because menopause is like one day of your life that you're officially not having your cycle for years. It's kind of a weird thing, but it's when your hormones are low as a female, that you have to make up for that loss of hormones and change how we train instead of the high volume. And it's really, I need to get Stacey on my podcast to say, okay, what if you're an endurance athlete? How should you train? She said, if you do a lot of zone 2, you might be storing more fat because it's raising your cortisol, and your body already knows how to go long. So you don't need as much long as a female. We're naturally able to do well in endurance, but now in this second half of your life, we may adjust how we train, doing a little bit more shorter, long distance stuff, and add more sprints to the finish, add more heavy weights that are 3 to 6 repetitions, 3 to 5 sets. And then doing some plyometrics and stuff. So it's really, I keep saying on my side of my world that don't blame the aging process, that this is what happens as I get older. I'm going to get fat, slow, and out of shape. That it's going to be embrace the aging process, adjust how you fuel, adjust how you train. Because of females, we don't have those hormones as high as we used to. But instead of not having those hormones, this is how we can make up for that loss and prioritizing the protein and the lifting. So I think it's, we got to look at, if you're not getting the results that you want, I say, what's the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results? Well, let's stop, pause, and reset your program and look at it from a different lens. So,
awesome.
Yeah.
I think we covered some fun topics, and I think that's a great spot to end on. But it's been great chatting, Debbie. I think it's something we should maybe do again in the future when we get another list of things to opine about.
Yeah. Well, everyone can send in their questions. I know it's a hard area out there. That's why I wanted to collaborate, because I think there's so much, because I'm hearing everyone that, as I said, the carnivore world, that's more the power lifters and doing their strength training, but you're the ultra endurance, I'm endurance, and looking at it from the aging athlete too, and the female athlete. I think we have to take all that information, then let's twist it a little bit for us in our community.
Mm-hmm. Right on. Well, thanks a bunch, Debbie.
All right. Thank you. Hey, before you leave, my fellow endurance athletes, just a reminder, if you like what you listened to today, please help me out. Share this episode with your community of fellow aging athletes. Also, you can head to debbiepotts.net to set up a free discovery call with me to learn about my personalized coaching programs. If you are struggling to get the desired results, even though you're doing all the so-called right things you hear about out there in our community, you may just need to adjust your workout and test and not guess with functional lab testing, nutritional therapy assessment, and get a personalized program to learn how to best fuel, train, and perform for the unique you to improve the aging process and work on training your future self now. So head to debbiepotts.net and let's talk more. All right, I lied. I have one more thing to remind you of. Head to sfuels.com to learn more of how you can fuel for your long distance training with their train formula drink mix that I just had on my long bike ride. And also they have S Fuels Race Plus. So when you are training and you need a little extra fuel for those high intensity pieces, or you're doing a race that's a little more tempo anaerobic, so zone 3, 4, 5, you may need an extra source of carbohydrates so you can go harder. So you've got the S Fuels Train to go longer, S Fuels Race Plus, and then they have post-workout, where we'll talk in an upcoming episode on nutrient timing, why we really need to have some protein and maybe some carbs in that post-workout window. Women, 30 minutes. Men can wait up to 3 hours. But check out S Fuels and use our code LOWCARBATHLETE upon checkout.
Thanks for listening to the Low Carb Athlete Podcast. If you have any questions, feedback, or topic suggestions, let us know on Facebook or at debbiepotts.net. You can help us continue and grow by leaving a review on iTunes. Thanks again, and see you next time.